Hey everybody, hope you are healthy and well. Um, and I hope that the assignment this week is off to a good start. Uh, I will be holding a Zoom the next time our class meets, which I think is Thursday, to go over any questions you guys have. But I wanted to do a PowerPoint today to sort of introduce you to the different blood types that you'll need for the activity that you'll be doing later today, and a little bit of overview. So uh, we will be talking about in this presentation a couple different types of blood cells. We'll talk about red blood cells, white blood cells, and platelets. We'll talk about the functions of blood, and we will talk about what happens if blood transfusions are done incorrectly. And we'll talk a little bit about what might happen if blood types differ between a mother and a fetus. So that's sort of the overview of this presentation. We'll start with the functions of blood. Lots of these you're probably already familiar with. We've talked about them a little bit throughout the year. Perhaps the most important one here is the fact that red blood cells deliver oxygen to all of the body cells. So the cardiovascular system and the respiratory system work very closely. We inhale oxygen, goes into our lungs. That oxygen travels straight into the bloodstream, back to the heart, and then gets pumped to the rest of the body to deliver that oxygen to the cells. As it's doing that, as it's delivering the oxygen to the cells of the body, it's also picking up carbon dioxide that the cells have produced as waste, carrying them back to the lungs in order for us to exhale and eliminate that waste from the body. We skipped over the endocrine system, which we were supposed to do next, and we might get to it after this one. But we did talk a little bit about hormones in different sections of this class. Those hormones that we've talked about and the ones that we haven't are all transported through the blood to different parts of the body. So it's sort of like a transportation mechanism for the hormones produced. Blood is really important in maintaining body temperature. We talked about that when we did the skin. We talked about how if we need to release heat from the body, the blood vessels dilate. That's why we appear red. And then the heat that's carried through the blood gets released into the atmosphere. And if we are cold, our blood vessels constrict in an effort to maintain that temperature within our body. Similarly, the blood helps to maintain pH in our body by carrying buffers through it. So, moral of the story here is blood is a really good transportation system. So, anything we need to transport through our body is carried through our blood system. Helps us maintain fluid volume. So, hydration basically makes sure that our water volume or our fluid volume's appropriate, works with our kidneys in that capacity. It prevents blood loss. So we'll talk about platelets and how they're important for blood clotting. And also very important is our ability to prevent infection with white blood cells and antibodies in the blood. So we'll talk a lot about that as we go forward. This next slide shows you several different types of blood cells. So when you think of blood cells, you usually think of these right here. These are the red blood cells. They're also called erythrocytes. They're the biconcave shaped cells, and their main function is to carry oxygen. But there are also all of these cells that might not look as familiar. These over here are the different types of white blood cells. And in a couple slides, we'll talk about the difference between all of these cells. But they mainly function with our immune system. And then finally, these little particles down here, these are platelets. So they're like larger cells that are sort of broken up into smaller segments. And these platelets in our blood are responsible for blood clotting, preventing blood loss. And I think we talked about them a little bit when we talked about the integumentary system as well, when we talked about blood clotting in the skin. So I don't know if you participated in the blood drive when they came to our school, but if you did, you might recognize this tube. This is the tube they use when they draw your blood. And then what they do after they draw the blood, and it all looks like one sort of deep red color, is they put it in something called a centrifuge and they spin it really fast. And it separates all of the different parts of the blood. So in the bottom, you'll have the cells, the red blood cells, the white blood cells, the platelets. And on the top, you have what we call the blood plasma. So you're probably hearing a lot about blood plasma on the news right now, and how individuals who have been infected with COVID-19 have antibodies in their blood that might be helpful to patients who are currently struggling with COVID. And basically what that means is this plasma section of their blood contains antibodies that their body recognizes from their infection with COVID-19. And those antibodies, if they were then placed in somebody who is currently infected, would be able to go fight the infection a lot faster because they would recognize the virus and be able to attack it without needing to make those antibodies themselves. So people who are donating their plasma basically donate their blood. So their blood comes out, they spin it, they separate it, and then they put this part of the blood back in the patient and they remove their plasma and donate their plasma to somebody who needs it. But anyway, the most common blood cell is the erythrocyte, the red blood cell. You can see in 1 microliter of blood, so 1 millimeter cubed of blood, you have 5 to 6 million erythrocytes, typically. And their job, as I said, was to transport oxygen and carbon dioxide to and from the cells of the body. There should be, in a healthy individual, around 5,000 to 10,000 white blood cells per microliter of blood. Now, if there's an infection, that number would be a lot higher because the body produces white blood cells in response to an infection because it's part of our immune system. It's how we fight that infection off. And then there are about 250,000 to 400,000 platelets in 1 microliter of blood. And they are responsible, as we said, for blood clotting. And then the rest of, so that makes up about 45% of the blood. The rest of it is the plasma, which is like the liquid portion of the blood. All right, so we're going to talk a little bit more about the different types of leukocytes here. The most common type of white blood cell is called a neutrophil. Neutrophils are basically our body's first responders to any sort of bacterial or fungal infection that might infect the body. If you see pus in a cut, it's likely neutrophils, a couple monocytes also probably, but neutrophils are most common in our bodies. First line of defense to fight infection. Eosinophils and basophils both come in response to some sort of reaction. So typically an allergic reaction or some sort of antigen response. We're going to talk about antigens in a little bit. The job of eosinophils and basophils is basically to initiate an immune response or a inflammatory response. I think we talked about histamines a little bit. When did we talk about histamines? Maybe in the, when did we talk about them? I don't even remember now. Maybe the integumentary system. But histamines are basically chemicals that increase vasodilation. So they cause our blood vessels to dilate, which allows more blood to flow to a region. So if you imagine having an allergic, let's say, there's a lot of pollen out right now. If you were to go outside, you would feel stuffy, your nose would feel swollen, your sinuses would feel tight, but you might blow your nose and nothing really comes out. That's because your body's releasing histamines. The basophils are releasing histamines and causing blood to rush to that region because they're sensing that pollen and that allergic reaction as a foreign invader. So even though it's not dangerous for us, our body's acting as if it is and initiating this inflammatory response. This is also what causes swelling if you get an infection. So that's what these white blood cells are responsible for. Lymphocytes are part of the lymphatic system. And when we talk about, if we talk about the immune system, which I hope we get to this year because I think it'll be interesting with everything going on, we'll talk a lot about B cells and T helper cells, cytotoxic T cells. These are cells that basically come about in response to an infection and help our body produce antibodies to fight a similar infection should it occur later. So if you get the flu, for instance, your body would recognize the influenza virus. They would produce T cells and B cells and launch this immune response against that virus, which we call our immune system. So we'll talk about lymphocytes a lot if we do the immune system in this class. And then finally, monocytes. Monocytes are phagocytic cells, meaning they basically eat pathogens and they eat dead debris. So if a virus were to get into the body, the monocytes would essentially eat the virus, take the antigen off of the virus and present it to a T cell and say, here is the virus, here's what it looks like, go get it. And then these T cells would go out and start fighting that virus. And then the monocyte also sort of works as the cleanup crew to break down dead cell debris, attack other microorganisms. So it's sort of like the cleanup crew of the white blood cells. All right, so next what we're going to talk about are blood types. And I think a lot of you might find this interesting, especially if you donated blood recently. The different blood types. There's type A blood. There's type B. So let's see if I can, I think I can write on here. So this would be like type A blood. This would be type B blood. This would be type AB blood. This would be type O blood. And this is a weird one. This is called Bombay blood. If I'm being honest, I didn't even really know much about this until I did this PowerPoint. I'll talk a little bit about this, but I'm really going to focus on these ones over here. So you'll notice these little things on the surface of most of these red blood cells, but not on these two over here. The things on the surface of the red blood cells are called antigens. So antigens are found on the surface of the blood cells, and basically they're like recognition tags for the blood cells. So type A cells have A antigens, type B cells have B antigens, type AB cells have both A and B antigens, and type O blood cells don't have any antigens on the middle. And here's where it gets a little bit tricky. If you're type A blood, then the plasma, which I showed you, it was the yellow looking stuff on the top after the centrifuge. If you're type A blood, then the plasma in your bloodstream carries anti-B antibodies. And you'll notice the anti-B antibodies have this Y shape here that fits right on the B antigen. Okay, and that becomes important in a little bit. If you're type B blood, you have anti-B antibodies. I don't know if I said that correctly. If you're type A blood, you have anti-B antibodies in the serum or in the plasma. If you're type B blood, you have anti-A antibodies in the plasma. And these are shaped more like this and fit the A antigen, whereas the anti-B antibody fits the B antigen. So they're specific to the different types of antigens. If you have both A and B antigens on your surface, then your plasma doesn't have any antibodies, because if it did, it would attack itself. And if you have type O blood, where you don't have any antigens on the red blood cells, then your body produces anti-A and anti-B antibodies and anti-AB. But anti-A and anti-B. So what this means is, if you have, I might come back to this slide, but oops, how do I get out of here? Here you go. Let's say you are type A blood. You have type A blood, okay? So you have a red blood cell with A antigens on it, these little circles here, all right? So you have a red blood cell and you have these A antigens on it. If you received type A blood from somebody, the plasma in their bloodstream would have anti-B antibodies in it, just like your plasma. So if that blood that you received mixed with your blood, the anti-B antibodies would not fit the A antigen on your red blood cells, which is good because it wouldn't cause them to clump up. Okay, so that's what we want to see. That's normal. But if, because the antibodies look like that and can't fit well on here, if you imagine it like a puzzle, they don't fit well. Now, imagine instead that you have type A blood, so same blood, and you receive type B blood in a blood transfusion. What's going to happen is type B blood's antibody looks more like this in the plasma. The antibody in type B blood's plasma looks more like that and fits right on top of your red blood cells. So you have type A blood, you receive type B blood, and the antibodies in the plasma of type B blood hook onto your blood cells. What that is going to cause is what we call agglutination, where it basically clumps up. And you can see down here a little bit better. Here is the type, I can't read this very well. Let's say this is a type B recipient and they receive type A blood. That type B recipient has anti-A antibodies in their bloodstream that hook onto those A blood cells, type A blood cells, and cause them to clump up in the small blood vessels. And that can cause really serious complications and often death because you get this clumping up of the blood. It would be really unpleasant. So this is why it's so important to get the right blood type in blood transfusions. And they didn't really used to understand that very well. So a lot of times blood transfusions weren't successful. Luckily, we understand it a lot better now, and they test very carefully, so that doesn't really happen anymore. But it's all about if you're type A blood, you have anti-B antibodies. If you're type B blood, you have anti-A antibodies. If you're type AB blood, you don't have any antibodies in the serum. And if you're type O blood, then you have all the antibodies in the serum. So you can sort of go down the line and say, well, type B blood can only receive type B blood. Type A can only receive type A, or type O. Either of them can receive type O. You know what? I think you're going to do this in your activity. So let's hold off on this. If we have more questions on this, we'll get into it, but this PowerPoint's getting a little bit long. So I'm going to, hopefully that makes sense. If you have questions, we can come back to it. But I'm just going to move forward quickly and talk about the Rh factor. So you might know I'm type A or I'm type B, or you might know I'm type A positive or A negative or B positive or B negative. The positive and negative deals with something called the Rh factor, and it's just another antigen that's on some red blood cells. So if you're let's say you're type A positive, then that would mean that your red blood cells have the A antigen and the Rh antigen on the surface. If you're type A negative, then your red blood cells have the A antigen but they don't have the Rh antigen. All right. So if an Rh positive person is transfused into an Rh negative person, blood transfused into an Rh negative person. The Rh negative person develops antibodies for an Rh factor, which will result in blood agglutination and eventually death. So if you put this positive blood with the positive Rh factor into somebody who doesn't have it, their body starts producing anti-Rh antibodies in the plasma. Eventually, those antibodies will hook on to these cells that were transfused and cause that agglutination that we talked about in the last slide, and eventually will result in death. Now, that doesn't really happen because, like I said, we test blood transfusions very carefully, and they hopefully wouldn't make the mistake of putting Rh positive blood into an Rh negative person. But this is when that problem sometimes arises. Imagine you have a mother who's Rh negative. So she does not have the antigen on her red blood cells, the Rh antigen on her red blood cells. Let's say father is positive and they conceive a baby and the baby gets the Rh positive blood. During the first pregnancy with the Rh negative mother and Rh positive child, the baby's blood isn't entering the mother's bloodstream. So this isn't really going to be a problem for the first pregnancy. However, after delivery, some of that baby's blood and the blood from the placenta is going to enter the mother's bloodstream. So that positive blood is going to enter the bloodstream, and it's going to cause the mother to develop those antibodies in her bloodstream. So she's going to develop anti-Rh antibodies in her bloodstream, and they'll stay there. Then let's say she gets pregnant again with another Rh positive baby. This is when you might see that problem because now she has those antibodies, and those antibodies in her plasma can pass into the baby. So if that happens, those antibodies are going to start attacking the baby's blood. And this is called, there are a couple different terms for it. Rh hemolytic disease is one of them. What's the other one? What is it? Something fetalis. Sorry, it's escaping my mind right now. But they talk about it a lot in the lab that you're going to do today. So the good news is they test for this during pregnancy, and there's a drug that can be given to limit the mother's antibodies if this scenario presents itself. So they've actually been able to limit this disease pretty significantly. All right, sorry that was such a long PowerPoint. Hopefully that's helpful going forward. I'll finish the rest of this PowerPoint for next week because we'll do the ECG labs and the rest of this is on ECGs. So if you have any questions, send Mrs. Broadhead or myself a message, and good luck. Thanks.